I never intended to become the custodian of these horrors. The leather-bound album arrived at my university office 3 months ago, packaged in weathered brown paper and twine, with no return address. Only my name, scrawled in faded ink that had bled at the edges from some long-ago dampness. Inside was a letter, yellowed with age, the paper brittle and threatening to disintegrate at my touch. To whomever receives these materials, it began, I entrust the terrible legacy of Dr. Solomon Merrick, my great-grandfather, whose work I have carried as a burden these many decades. I am the last of my line, and with my passing, someone else must bear witness. The photographs must not be destroyed, though God knows I've been tempted. They are evidence of something beyond our understanding, a glimpse behind the veil that perhaps we were never meant to see. The letter was signed simply Margaret Merrick, dated just 2 weeks before its arrival. A quick search revealed her obituary in a small New England newspaper. She had died childless and alone, at the age of 93. I am a professor of photographic history at Miskatonic University. My specialty is early daguerreotype and wet plate collodion processes, those first faltering steps into capturing light and shadow that revolutionized how we see the world. I've published extensively on forgotten pioneers of the medium, those who worked in the shadow of Daguerre and Fox Talbot. But I had never encountered the name Solomon Merrick in any of my research. That first night, I opened the album in my study as rain lashed against the windows, a late autumn storm that had rolled in from the Atlantic. Lightning occasionally illuminated the room, casting sharp, momentary shadows across the walls. A fitting atmosphere, I would later realize, for what I was about to discover. The album itself was exquisite, bound in dark leather with tarnished silver clasps, the craftsmanship suggesting considerable expense. On the first page, written in a precise, educated hand, the transcendental photographic experiments of Dr. Solomon Merrick, Boston, Massachusetts. Commenced January 1853. Below this heading was affixed a small calling card with an address in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood, and a daguerreotype portrait of a man I presumed to be Merrick himself. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with a high forehead, deep-set eyes beneath heavy brows, and a full beard. He wore the formal attire typical of a gentleman of means from that period, but something in his expression struck me immediately, an intensity in his gaze that seemed to penetrate the camera lens, reaching across more than a century and a half to fix upon me directly. The first several pages contained what appeared to be conventional portraits. Men and women posed stiffly before painted backdrops, their expression solemn due to the long exposure times required. Yet even these seemed somehow wrong. The eyes of the subjects appeared unnaturally bright, almost luminous, while the shadows that fell behind them seemed deeper than they should have been, as if threatening to swallow the sitter's whole. Each photograph was meticulously labeled with a name, date, and cryptic notations. Subject exhibits moderate luminance, or etheric residue minimal, requires enhanced exposure parameters. The technical notes that accompanied these images described modifications to standard wet plate collodion chemistry, additions of silver nitrate in unusual concentrations, experimental fixatives, and substances I didn't recognize, tincture of belladonna, powdered mandrake root, and distilled essence of nightshade. All toxic, all associated with ancient mysticism and witchcraft rather than photography. And then there was something he called moon salt, repeatedly referenced but never explained. As I turned each page, the photographs grew progressively stranger. The subjects remained superficially normal, but the shadows behind them began to take on shapes that didn't correspond to their bodies, elongated, distorted, with suggestions of limbs where there should be none. In some, the shadow seemed to be reaching toward the subject, as if attempting to embrace them from behind. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the storm outside. As a historian of photography, I knew immediately that these images should not exist, could not exist, using the technology of 1853. The manipulation of shadows independent of their subjects was simply impossible with the photographic processes of that era. On page 17, I found the first portrait of a corpse, a practice not uncommon in the Victorian era, when postmortem photography served as memorials for loved ones. The subject was an elderly woman, laid out in her coffin, hands folded peacefully over her chest. but her shadow, cast sharply against the wall behind her, showed a figure sitting upright, its head turned to stare directly at the camera. My hand trembled as I turned to the next page, where I found Merrick's notes. Subject: Mrs. Eleanor Winters, aged 72 years. Deceased 6 hours prior to exposure. First successful capture of the departing soul's shadow state. The spirit appears confused, lingering near its former vessel. Note the distinct separation between corporeal shadow and spectral manifestation. The moon salt mixture proves effective in slowing the transition between worlds. The next several entries followed a similar pattern. The recently deceased, their shadows showing movement, awareness, distinct expressions of confusion or distress. Merrick's notes grew more clinical, more detached, as if the human subjects were merely specimens for his investigation. The soul leaves impressions in the ether for approximately 9 to 12 hours post-mortem, after which it becomes increasingly difficult to capture. Have increased moon salt concentration by 15% with promising results. Must secure more fresh subjects. I closed the album, suddenly aware that my heart was racing. Outside, the storm had intensified, raindrops striking my window like desperate fingers seeking entrance. I poured myself a generous measure of whiskey and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. As a scientist and historian, I wanted to dismiss these images as elaborate hoaxes, perhaps double exposures or some other trickery. Yet the processes described would have been beyond the technical capabilities of even the most advanced photographers of that era. And there was something about the shadows themselves, a quality of depth, of presence, that disturbed me on a visceral level. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps this Merrick was S.I. simply documenting his attempts at fraud, a series of experiments in fabricating spirit photographs to exploit the grieving, a practice that became common in the latter half of the 19th century. Yet if that were the case, why keep such meticulous records? And why would his great-granddaughter preserve them for all these years, only to pass them on with such ominous warnings? Sleep eluded me that night. In the darkness of my bedroom, the shadows in the corners seemed deeper than usual, more substantive. I found myself avoiding looking directly at them, afraid of what shapes I might discern in their depths. The next morning, fueled by coffee and professional curiosity, I began researching Solomon Merrick. The university archives yielded nothing, nor did the standard histories of early American photography. It wasn't until I accessed digitized records from Massachusetts General Hospital that I found him, listed as an attending physician from 1848 to 1854, specializing in neurological disorders. There was no record of what became of him after 1854. That afternoon, I returned to the album, steeling myself for what I might discover in its pages. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. A methodical descent into madness and horror, documented with scientific precision. And as the autumn light faded from my study windows, casting long shadows across my desk, I could have sworn that, just for a moment, one of those shadows moved independently of its source, reaching, with elongated fingers, toward the album that chronicled the terrible experiments of Dr. Solomon Merrick. The second chapter of Merrick's photographic journey revealed an escalation that still haunts me. As I continued through the album, the dates jumped forward several months, to late summer of 1853. The handwriting had changed subtly, still precise, but with a feverish quality, the pressure of the pen leaving deeper impressions in the page. August 17, 1853. Have secured position as consulting physician at Blackwood Sanitarium. Director Hargrove proves remarkably accommodating to my research requirements in exchange for my services. The isolated location and patient population present ideal conditions for extended study. Accompanying this entry was a photograph of a formidable stone building set against a hillside, surrounded by dense forest. Even in the sepia tones of the image, Blackwood Sanitarium radiated a foreboding presence, its narrow windows like watchful eyes staring out from the shadow of towering elms. The next several pages documented Merrick's new subjects, patients of the sanitarium. Unlike the earlier portraits, these individuals were not posed formally. They were photographed in their rooms, sometimes restrained in chairs or beds, their expressions vacant or distressed, and their shadows, God, their shadows were wrong in ways that defy rational explanation. One young woman, identified as Miss Sarah Collins, melancholia with catatonic features, sat motionless in a wooden chair. Her shadow, however, depicted a figure in violent motion, arms raised as if fending off attackers, mouth open in a silent scream. Merrick's notes were coldly analytical. Subject exhibits extraordinary shadow dissociation. Her physical form remains immobile while her soul's shadow demonstrates extreme agitation. Hypothesis: the consciousness and soul are not unified in cases of severe mental disturbance. The mind may be imprisoned while the soul thrashes against its confinement. A man identified only as Patient 27, delusional paranoia, stared blankly at the camera, but his shadow showed two distinct forms, one matching his seated posture, the other standing beside him, leaning down as if whispering in his ear. Merrick's annotation: evidence of parasitic spiritual attachment. The secondary entity appears to be feeding on the subject's etheric energy. Moon salt exposure reveals what the naked eye cannot perceive. I found myself shuddering as I turned each page, yet unable to stop. These were not mere photographs but windows into suffering, into a realm of existence that should remain hidden. And through it all, Merrick's commentary grew increasingly disconnected from conventional medical understanding, veering into a dark amalgamation of pseudoscience and occultism. The boundary between mind and soul is not fixed but permeable. In cases of severe mental affliction, this membrane becomes thin, allowing for slippage and intrusion. The camera, properly calibrated with moon salt infusion, captures what our limited human perception cannot: the true state of the soul distinct from its corporeal anchor. Halfway through this section, the photographs began to include Merrick himself, self-portraits taken with the aid of a shutter string. In the first of these, dated September 3rd, he appeared much as he had in the initial daguerreotype, though perhaps more gaunt, the shadows beneath his eyes more pronounced. His own shadow, cast against a plain wall behind him, matched his posture perfectly. But as the sequence progressed, subtle changes emerged. By late September, his shadow showed slight divergences, the angle of the head different, the posture more rigid than his physical form. By early October, the differences were unmistakable. While Merrick stood straight-backed before the camera, his shadow hunched forward, its head inclined as if examining something on the floor, its proportions elongated beyond natural human dimensions. Merrick's notes about these self-portraits were sparse, almost evasive, focusing instead on technical adjustments to his process. Only one entry acknowledged the anomaly directly. October 12th, the observer effect becomes increasingly evident. Prolonged exposure to subjects exhibiting shadow dissociation appears to induce similar phenomena in the researcher. This presents both a methodological concern and an unprecedented opportunity for first-hand documentation. The final pages of this section contained what Merrick called his moonlight studies, photographs taken under the full moon rather than with artificial light. These images were among the most disturbing in the collection. The sanitarium grounds at night, empty save for shadows that seemed to move between the trees. A photograph of the patient's cemetery, where the gravestones cast shadows that stretched impossibly toward the camera, some appearing to rise vertically from the ground like dark figures standing at attention. And most chillingly, a series taken from Merrick's window, focusing on the forest edge beyond the sanitarium walls. In each successive image, the tree line remained constant, but the darkness between the trunks seemed to grow more concentrated, more intentional, gradually resolving into a suggestion of faces and forms watching the building, watching Merrick's window specifically. His final note in this section read simply, "They have become aware of my observation. They are curious about the one who sees them." Disturbed beyond measure, I closed the album again, suddenly conscious of the lengthening afternoon shadows in my own study. The rational part of my mind, the academic, the scientist, insisted that these must be elaborate fabrications. Yet something deeper, more primal, recognized a terrible authenticity in these images. That evening, I found myself obsessively checking the shadows in my home, behind furniture, in corners, cast by lamps onto walls. Were they the right shape? Did they move when they shouldn't? Was that a trick of tired eyes? Or did that shadow just turn its head? I slept with the lights on that night, something I hadn't done since childhood. And still, in the moments before sleep claimed me, I could swear the shadows were growing deeper, more substantial, gathering at the edges of the light like spectators at the periphery of an event, waiting for their moment to step forward. The next morning, I contacted a colleague at Massachusetts State Archives to inquire about Blackwood Sanitarium. The response came swiftly. Yes, such an institution had existed, situated in the remote hills of western Massachusetts. It had operated from 1832 until a devastating fire in December 1853 claimed the lives of 47 patients and staff. The cause of the fire was never conclusively determined. December 1853. The chronology aligned too perfectly with Merrick's album to be coincidental. With growing apprehension, I turned to the next section, knowing what horrors likely awaited me but unable to turn away, compelled to bear witness to the final descent of Dr. Solomon Merrick into the shadows he had sought to capture. The third section of Merrick's album began with a significant tonal shift. The methodical, clinical notations gave way to longer, almost feverish journal entries. The handwriting remained precise but had become smaller, more compressed, as if Merrick were trying to contain an expanding volume of thoughts within the limited space of the page. November 1st, 1853, All Saints' Day. The veil between worlds is at its thinnest, according to folk superstition, yet the scientific measurement of etheric density through photographic means confirms this ancient wisdom. Extraordinary shadow activity throughout Blackwood last night. Patients universally agitated. Hargrove questions my methods, threatens to rescind my access. He cannot see what is happening here. He is blind to the revelation unfolding before us. The accompanying photograph showed a corridor of the sanitarium at night, apparently empty. Yet the shadows along the walls bore no relation to the architecture. Elongated, humanoid shapes stretching toward the ceiling, reaching for one another across the hallway. In the far distance, where the corridor curved out of sight, a deeper darkness seemed to pool, as if the shadows were congregating just beyond the camera's view. November 3rd, breakthrough achieved. The modification of the collodion process with increased moon salt concentration and the addition of powdered belladonna root has yielded the first successful photograph of a subject not physically present. Patient Elizabeth Gale, deceased October 27th, appears clearly in this morning's exposure of her former room, though the chamber was empty. Her shadow, however, indicates awareness of the camera's presence. She turned to look at me as the plate was exposed. The photograph in question showed an austere sanitarium room, a narrow bed with iron frame, a small table, a chair, a window with bars. In the corner stood a translucent female figure, her features indistinct but her posture one of startled attention, head turned toward the camera. Her shadow, however, was solid black and sharp-edged, stretching across the floor and up the wall behind her, and it showed a figure with arms outstretched, hands curved into claws, mouth open in what appeared to be a snarl or scream. My blood ran cold as I studied this image. If this were merely a double exposure, a rational explanation I desperately wanted to embrace, then the shadow should have been as faint as the figure. But it wasn't. It was darker, more substantial than any other shadow in the room, as if the spectral woman cast a more solid shadow than physical objects. The next pages documented Merrick's increasingly deliberate attempts to photograph the dead. He began visiting the sanitarium cemetery at night, particularly on evenings with a waning moon, which he noted facilitated transition while maintaining sufficient light for exposure. The resulting images showed misty figures among the gravestones, some barely perceptible, others alarmingly distinct. And always, their shadows betrayed a different aspect, reaching, contorting, or turning toward Merrick's camera with evident awareness. November 12th, the subjects have begun to recognize the camera. Some now pose willingly. Others flee, though their shadows often linger, turning back to observe me. Most troubling are those that approach, drawing closer with each subsequent plate, as if using the photographic process itself as a means of manifestation. A sequence of 3 photographs illustrated this observation. Each showed the same corner of the cemetery, taken at intervals of approximately 5 minutes, according to Merrick's notations. In the first, A faint, luminous figure could be discerned near a distant tree. In the second, it had moved halfway toward the camera. In the third, it stood in the foreground, its features resolved into the face of a middle-aged man with hollow eyes and a look of desperate hunger. Its shadow, stretching behind it, had arms that ended not in hands but in twisted, branch-like appendages that seemed to curl toward Merrick's position. November 15th. They come to my window now, drawn to the silver and chemicals. I hear them scratching at the glass after midnight. The patients in nearby rooms have begun to complain of disturbed sleep, of whispers and the sensation of cold hands upon them in the darkness. Hargrove blames me, though he cannot articulate why. He lacks the vision to comprehend what is awakening here. November 20th. I no longer require the camera to see them. They have become visible to my naked eye, particularly in low light. This development both thrills and concerns me. Am I experiencing a sympathetic alteration of perception due to prolonged exposure to these phenomena, or have they grown stronger through my documentation of them? Theory: the act of observation through the photographic process may be strengthening their connection to our plane of existence. The photographs from late November showed a marked deterioration in technical quality. The compositions haphazard, the exposures inconsistent. Yet the content grew more disturbing. Merrick had begun photographing his own room at the sanitarium, documenting what appeared to be a gradual invasion. Shadows gathering in corners, stretching across his bed at impossible angles. Luminous mists forming faces that peered from behind furniture. And most disturbingly, increasingly clear images of figures standing over him while he slept, their features growing more defined with each successive night. November 28th. I dreamed I was in the darkroom, developing not plates but my own skin, watching as images rose to the surface, faces pressing outward as if trying to emerge. I woke to find fresh chemical burns on my hands, though I had not been working with the solutions. The mirror shows changes I cannot account for. My shadow no longer moves in perfect synchronization with my body. It lingers, turns to watch me when I look away. I have begun to photograph myself daily to document these changes. These self-portraits confirmed a marked physical transformation. Over the course of just weeks, Merrick had become gaunt, his skin ashen, his eyes deeply sunken yet bright with an unnatural intensity. His previously well-trimmed beard had grown wild and unkempt. But most alarming was the progression of his shadow's independence. Subtle at first, then increasingly blatant. By the final self-portrait, dated December 1st, Merrick stood facing the camera while his shadow on the wall behind him faced in the opposite direction, looking back over its shoulder toward him in a pose that would have been physically impossible for Merrick himself to achieve. The last entry in this section sent ice through my veins. December 3rd. Hargrove has ordered my removal from Blackwood, effective tomorrow. Claims my presence has become destabilizing to the therapeutic environment. The fool. He fails to understand that we stand at the threshold of the greatest scientific discovery since Galileo turned his telescope to the heavens. I have already packed my essential equipment and materials. But I cannot abandon my subjects, or perhaps it is more accurate now to say that. They will not abandon me. They whisper that they can follow me, that our connection transcends physical proximity. I believe them. My shadow confirms it has become a doorway for them. I have one final experiment planned tonight that will cement our bond permanently. The page ended there, with no photograph accompanying this final entry. I turned to the next section with a growing sense of dread, knowing that in just 4 days, Blackwood Sanitarium would be consumed by fire, claiming dozens of lives. What had Merrick done on the night of December 3rd? And what had followed him when he left that place of shadow and suffering? The fourth section of Merrick's album began not with a photograph or journal entry, but with a newspaper clipping dated December 5, 1853, from the Boston Daily Courier. Fire at Blackwood Sanitarium claims 3 lives. West Stockbridge. A fire of unknown origin claimed the lives of 3 staff members at Blackwood Sanitarium late Sunday evening. The blaze, which began in the east wing of the facility, was contained before spreading to patient quarters, thanks to the quick action of attendants. Among the deceased was Dr. Edward Hargrove, director of the institution. Authorities are investigating the cause of the conflagration. Beside this, Merrick had written a single line. The first report is always incomplete. They will find the others soon enough. 2 days later, December 7th, another clipping from the same newspaper. Death toll rises at Blackwood AS. More bodies discovered West Stockbridge. Workers sifting through the damaged east wing of Blackwood Sanitarium have made a grim discovery. 12 additional bodies were recovered from the basement level, where it is believed patients had been improperly housed. Governor Clifford has ordered a full investigation into practices at the facility. Identification of the deceased continues, hampered by the condition of the remains. Merrick's annotation: they will never identify them correctly. Some were already long dead before the fire claimed their forms. The shadows have moved on. The final clipping, dated December 14th, reported the total death toll at 47, with the fire having ultimately consumed most of the sanitarium. The cause was officially ruled accidental, attributed to a chemical spill in a storage room, though the reporter noted that circumstances surrounding the disaster remain clouded in contradiction and mystery. Following these news items came Merrick's own account, written in a hand that had changed dramatically, jagged, sprawling across the page, with erratic pressure that sometimes tore through the paper. December 18, 1853. I have established new quarters in the basement of an abandoned church in North Boston. The stone walls and absence of windows provide ideal darkness for my advanced work. I brought with me those subjects most amenable to continued study. 7 in total, though their forms grow increasingly difficult to perceive with conventional vision. Their shadows, however, have never been more distinct. I no longer require the moon salt compound for manifestation. My own altered chemistry appears sufficient as a catalyst. The shadows respond to my presence, emerging unbidden when I enter a room. They recognize me as their intermediary, their bridge to this plane. And I have begun to see through their eyes when I close my own. Glimpses of the world they inhabit, a negative reflection of our own, where darkness has substance and light is the void. The accompanying photographs from this period were unlike anything I had seen before in the album. Taken in near total darkness, they showed only vague outlines of Merrick's new workspace. Stone walls, a makeshift laboratory, a cot in the corner. But the shadows were photographed with impossible clarity, appearing not as absences of light but as positive entities with depth and texture. They gathered around Merrick's equipment, pooled beneath his work table, stretched across the ceiling in patterns that suggested vast, reaching wings. And in several images, they had begun to take on recognizable human features, faces emerging from the darkness, eyes and mouths formed from deeper shadow within shadow, staring directly into the camera with expressions of hunger, yearning, or malevolent anticipation. December 25th, Christmas Day passes unmarked in the world below. My subjects do not recognize human festivals, though they sense the altered emotional currents of the city above. They grow restive when churches fill, bells ring, prayers are offered. These activities appear to repel them, driving them deeper into the shadows. Note: investigate potential repulsion effect of concentrated faith or ritualized devotion. I have not ventured above ground in 9 days. Food supplies dwindling, but hunger has become abstract, disconnected from bodily necessity. Sleep cycles increasingly irregular. When unconsciousness claims me, I travel to their realm. They show me wonders and horrors beyond human comprehension. I have begun attempting to photograph my dreams. What followed were the most technically innovative and conceptually disturbing images in the collection. Merrick had apparently developed a method of exposing photographic plates to no external light whatsoever, but rather to what he described as emanations from the mind's eye during somnambulistic states. The resulting photographs resembled abstract patterns of light and dark, yet carried a deeply unsettling quality, suggestions of landscape and architecture that obeyed no earthly physics, populated by elongated figures that seemed to be composed entirely of shadow, yet moved through their environment as if substantial. January 3, 1854, the integration accelerates. My shadow now moves independently more often than not. It has begun to communicate with the others even when I am consciously engaged elsewhere. I observe it gesturing, reaching, embracing. The The sensation is not unlike what physicians describe in patients with phantom limb syndrome. I feel movements I am not making, experience touch without physical contact. The others have revealed their true purpose. They were never mere subjects for study. They sought me specifically, drawn to my unique perception, my willingness to see. They require a dedicated vessel, a living anchor in this world. The photographs were only the beginning, a means of establishing initial connection. What follows is true communion. The self-portraits from January 1854 documented a man in the final stages of physical deterioration, emaciated to the point of skeletal appearance, eyes sunken yet burning with feverish intensity, skin bearing strange discolorations like chemical stains or bruises. In the background of these images, shadows gathered with increasing density, some taking forms that vaguely resembled the patients from Blackwood, others entirely inhuman in their proportions. Most disturbing was the progressive separation between Merrick and his own shadow. In the final self-portrait, dated January 15th, Merrick stood before the camera while his shadow appeared several feet away, seemingly engaged in conversation with other, darker shapes that clustered around it. The boundary between Merrick's physical form and the shadow had begun to blur, with tendrils of darkness extending from the shadow toward the man, connected like umbilical cords to his chest, head, and hands. January 17th, the merger is nearly complete. I exist simultaneously in two worlds, straddling the boundary between light and shadow. They whisper that I am ready for the final transition, but require additional vessels for what is to come. They hunger for more shadows to join their collective. I have identified suitable candidates among the indigent population near the harbor. No one will miss them. Their shadows will serve a greater purpose. The following pages contained portraits of 7 individuals, street people, by their appearance, photographed in what looked like the basement of the abandoned church. Their expressions ranged from confusion to terror. And in each image, their shadows were already separating from them, reaching toward Merrick's position behind the camera, while darker shapes loomed behind them, poised as if preparing to strike or embrace. January 29th, the harvest is complete. 7 souls, 7 shadows, 7 doorways. The circle requires one more to be complete. My own contribution freely given. Tonight, as the new moon enshrouds the world in perfect darkness, we will enact the final ritual of separation. I will step fully into the shadow realm, leaving behind only the vessel, while my subjects' abandoned forms will serve as anchors for those waiting to cross in the opposite direction. The balance must be maintained. As I enter their world, they will enter mine. This journal and photographic record I entrust to my colleague Dr. James Whitby, who alone has shown interest in my research without prejudice or superstition. May it serve as both testament and warning to those who follow. The boundary between worlds is thinner than humanity suspects, and growing thinner still. The shadows are patient, but their hunger is eternal. This entry was the last in Merrick's own hand. What followed was a brief note in different handwriting, dated February 3, 1854. I have secured this document and the accompanying photographic materials as requested by my friend and colleague, Solomon Merrick, though I confess I do so with grave reservations. The basement chamber where I found these items, as per his final letter to me, contained evidence of events I cannot reconcile with natural law or rational understanding. Of Solomon himself, there was no sign, save for a camera positioned on a tripod, facing an empty chair draped with his clothing. The exposed plate within the camera, which I have developed and included as the final image in this collection, defies explanation. I leave it to future scholars, perhaps possessed of scientific knowledge beyond our current understanding, to determine its significance. May God have mercy on Solomon's soul, wherever it may now reside. James Whitby, M.D. With trembling hands, I turned to the final photograph in this section. It showed a simple wooden chair with clothing laid across it, a jacket, shirt, and trousers consistent with what Merrick had worn in his self-portraits. The clothing was arranged as if someone had been sitting there and simply vanished, leaving the garments to collapse in their absence. But the shadow cast by the empty chair and clothing was that of a man, standing upright, arms outstretched, head thrown back as if in ecstasy or agony. And surrounding this impossible shadow were others, 7 distinct humanoid silhouettes, their edges blurring into one another, their forms stretched and distorted beyond human proportions, yet recognizably derived from the 7 unfortunate souls in Merrick's final portraits. I closed the album, my hands shaking so badly I could barely secure the clasp. Outside, the sun had set while I was immersed in Merrick's descent into madness, leaving my study in darkness save for the single desk lamp illuminating the album. I reached quickly for the overhead light switch, unwilling to remain in shadow a moment longer. As light flooded the room, I glanced down at the floor beside my desk and froze. For just an instant, before reason and sanity could reassert themselves, I could have sworn my shadow remained motionless as I turned, its head inclined as if studying the album with terrible interest. The 5th section of Merrick's album began not with his own photographs, but with a series of official documents compiled by Dr. James Whitby in the aftermath of his colleague's disappearance. Police reports, witness statements, newspaper clippings, and Whitby's own increasingly disturbed journal entries created a fragmented narrative of what followed the events in the abandoned church basement. The first document was a Boston Police Department missing persons report dated February 1, 1854, filed by Whitby himself. It described Solomon Merrick as approximately 43 years of age, 5 feet 11 inches in height, slender build, dark hair and beard, last seen January 26 in the vicinity of North Boston. The report noted that Merrick had been behaving erratically in the weeks prior to his disappearance, and had recently been dismissed from his position at Blackwood Sanitarium due to concerns regarding his mental stability. A supplementary note, dated February 5, indicated that officers had investigated the abandoned church where Merrick was believed to have been living but found no evidence of his current whereabouts. They did, however, note unusual conditions in the basement level, including chemical equipment, a makeshift darkroom, and ritualistic markings on the floor and walls. The investigation was ongoing. Whitby's first journal entry, dated February 7, revealed his growing disquiet. I have begun to question the wisdom of fulfilling Solomon's request to preserve his photographic work. Since collecting these materials 3 days ago, I have experienced increasingly troubling phenomena in my home. Items misplaced, sounds without source, and a persistent sensation of being observed from the corners of rooms. Most disturbing are the shadows. They seem to linger after their casting objects are removed from light, and sometimes appear to move independently in my peripheral vision. I have secured the album in a locked cabinet in my study, yet twice now I have found it lying open on my desk in the morning, though I am certain I was alone in the house overnight. The daguerreotype plates themselves appear unchanged, yet the shadows within them seem somehow deeper, more substantial each time I examine them. I fear Solomon's obsession may have been contagious or worse, justified. Newspaper clippings from mid-February documented a series of disappearances in Boston's North End, 7 people in total, all within a 10-day period. The victims shared no obvious connections beyond their social marginality. A dock worker, 2 homeless men, a laundress, an elderly widow, a street vendor, and a young prostitute. Police speculated about a possible serial abductor but had no suspects. Whitby's journal entry from February 20th made an alarming connection. The disappeared matched the subjects in Solomon's final photographs, not in specific identity but in number and general characteristics. 7 souls, as he wrote. 7 doorways. I can no longer dismiss this as mere coincidence. I have begun photographing my own home at night while I sleep, a camera fixed upon a tripod, the shutter string tied to a clockwork mechanism of my own design that triggers exposure at 3-hour intervals. The results confirm my worst fears. There are figures moving through my rooms in the darkness, their forms indistinct but their shadows sharp and substantial. And they gather around the cabinet where I keep Solomon's album, as if drawn to it, or to what it contains. The next items were a series of photographs, clearly taken by Whitby himself, using techniques similar to Merrick's. The initial images showed ordinary rooms in what appeared to be a well-appointed Boston townhouse, a study with bookshelves and medical volumes, a parlor with formal furniture, a bedroom with a 4-poster bed. But as the sequence progressed, anomalies emerged. Shadows that didn't correspond to any visible objects. dark smudges in corners that gradually resolved into suggestions of faces or limbs. And most disturbingly, a recurring silhouette that strongly resembled Merrick himself, standing beside Whitby's bed, leaning over his sleeping form, its proportions elongated beyond human possibility, its head sometimes turned toward the camera as if aware of being observed. Whitby's journal entries grew increasingly fragmented and paranoid. February 27th, sleep has become impossible without laudanum, and even then, my dreams are invaded by images from the photographs. I see Solomon beckoning to me from thresholds that should not exist, doorways formed of deeper shadow within ordinary darkness. The others are with him always, the 7 he harvested, and others I do not recognize, figures formed of living darkness that move with terrible purpose. March 3rd, I brought the album to Professor Ellsworth at the university, seeking his rational assessment. He examined several plates and pronounced them clever frauds, citing double exposure techniques and chemical manipulation. His smug certainty enraged me. How dare he dismiss what is so clearly authentic? As he handed the album back, I noticed his shadow on the wall behind him flicker and distort, though he moved not at all. He did not see it, but I did. They are spreading. They are watching through our shadows. March 10th. I have not left my home in 5 days. Food supplies dwindling but cannot risk venturing out. They wait at the windows after sunset, pressing against the glass. Not physical forms but deeper darkness that somehow has weight, substance. The shadows under my door writhe and reach inward each night, pulling back only with the dawn. I have written to Solomon's only living relative, his brother William in New York, inquiring whether any family history might explain Solomon's obsession with the boundary between worlds. His response arrived yesterday, disturbingly brief. Destroy everything he left behind. Burn it all. They can follow the images like a scent. A newspaper clipping dated March 15th reported a house fire at an address I recognized as Whitby's residence from earlier documents. The article noted that Dr. James Whitby had been pulled from the burning building by neighbors, but had succumbed to his injuries at Massachusetts General Hospital the following day. The cause of the fire was undetermined, though the reporter mentioned unusual burn patterns that suggested it had begun in multiple locations simultaneously. A final note, written in a shaky hand on hospital stationery and dated March 16, 1854. This testimony I leave as my final medical observation. The shadows have substance. They have will. Solomon discovered not a photographic technique but a means of manifestation. The images are not records but gateways. I have burned the album, but I fear this action came too late. They have found their way through. As I lie here in my hospital bed, I see them gathering in the corners of the room, growing bolder, no longer retreating from the lamplight. My own shadow no longer mimics my movements but turns to watch me with patient malevolence. Solomon's face forms within it occasionally, his expression both pitying and hungry. To whoever finds this record, the photographs must never be recreated. The technique must be forgotten. There are things that wait in the darkness between worlds, and they have learned our shape now. They wear our shadows like garments, learning to navigate our reality through these two-dimensional projections of our existence. They are coming for... The note ended abruptly, the pen trailing off into a jagged line that suggested a sudden seizure or loss of consciousness. Below it, a hospital orderly had written, "Found clutched in the hand of Dr. J. Whitby at time of death, 3:17 a.m., March 16, 1854. After these grim documents came a gap in the chronology. Nearly 4 decades during which the album had apparently passed into the possession of William Merrick, Solomon's brother, who had neither destroyed it as he had advised Whitby to do, nor continued the terrible work it documented. The next entry was dated 1891, written in an elegant feminine hand. September 4, 1891. Upon the death of my father, William Merrick, I have inherited this troubling artifact of my uncle's madness. Father kept it locked in a lead-lined box in his bank vault, removing it only once yearly, on the anniversary of Uncle Solomon's disappearance, to verify that it remained secure. Father never explained his reasons for preserving what he clearly regarded with superstitious dread, saying only that some things are too dangerous to destroy improperly and impossible to destroy completely. He extracted from me a solemn promise to continue its custodianship, a burden I accept with reluctance and misgiving. I have examined the contents briefly and find them disturbing beyond measure, yet compelling in their technical innovation. Uncle Solomon, whatever his delusions, was clearly a photographic pioneer whose methods anticipated developments that would not become standard for decades. The artistic quality of certain images, particularly the dream photographs, suggests a talent that might have earned recognition had it been directed toward less morbid subjects. I will follow Father's protocol, returning the album to secure storage and examining it only on the designated anniversary. Perhaps in time, when superstition has yielded fully to science, these materials can be properly evaluated by experts in the field. Margaret Merrick. Margaret's annual notes continued for several years, brief and businesslike, recording that the album had been inspected and returned to storage without incident. But in 1897, the tone changed abruptly. February 1, 1897. I have broken protocol and removed the album 2 weeks ahead of schedule, driven by troubling dreams that have plagued me since the new year. In these nightmares, a man I somehow recognize as Uncle Solomon, though I never knew him in life, stands at the foot of my bed, beckoning. Behind him gathers a crowd of shadow figures, their features indistinct save for their eyes, pinpricks of deeper darkness that fix upon me with hungry anticipation. Most disturbing is that these dreams have begun to intrude upon my waking life. Twice this week I have woken to find myself standing before the vault in my dressing gown, with no memory of having left my bed, and the shadows in my home have taken on an unsettling quality. Deeper than they should be, persistent even when the light source moves, occasionally seeming to move independently of their casting objects. I have set up a camera in my bedroom, using the automatic exposure mechanism described in Uncle Solomon's notes. I must determine whether these experiences are mere hallucinations born of family stories and suggestible imagination, or something more tangible. The photographs that followed were chillingly familiar. A well-appointed Victorian bedroom, empty save for furniture, yet with shadows that defied natural law. A human silhouette on the wall where none should be. A darker patch beside the bed that resembled a standing figure leaning over the sleeping form of Margaret herself. And most disturbing, a sequence showing her bedroom door slowly opening, though no human figure entered, only a deeper darkness that pooled on the threshold before extending tendrils toward the bed. February 10, 1897. I can no longer dismiss what is happening as delusion. Whatever madness claimed Uncle Solomon now reaches for me across the decades. The photographs do not lie. There is a presence in my home, drawn to me through my blood connection to its original vessel. I have consulted Dr. Harrison Winters, a former colleague of Father's who specialized in esoteric traditions before retiring from academic life. Upon viewing the album and my recent photographs, he confirmed what I had begun to suspect, that the moon salt compound central to Uncle Solomon's process contains elements known in certain mystical practices to thin the veil between worlds. The chemical formula, which I located in the earliest pages of the album, includes silver nitrate, standard in photography, but also less conventional ingredients. Powdered moonstone, sea salt harvested during the dark of the moon, and traces of belladonna and henbane, all associated in folk tradition with opening the eyes to unseen realms. Dr. Winters believes the photographic process itself is significant. The creation of negatives as an intermediate step between reality and final image creates a liminal space where entities from shadow realms may gain purchase in our world. Each photograph taken with the moon salt compound widened this breach, with Merrick's obsessive documentation eventually creating a permanent passage. Most troubling is Winters' conviction that these entities are neither ghosts nor demons in the conventional sense, but something older and more fundamental, primordial consciousnesses that existed in the darkness before light, before form, before the separation of dimensions. They hunger for definition, for substance, and find in human shadows a pathway to manifestation. He has provided me with protective measures drawn from various traditions. Lines of salt at thresholds, iron nails at windows, mirrors placed to reflect shadows back upon themselves. I implement these with desperate hope, though Winters himself seemed doubtful of their efficacy against what he called the oldest dark. Margaret's entries continued through late February, documenting an escalating intrusion of shadow phenomena. Objects moved in the night, unexplained cold spots in her home, and most alarmingly, periods of missing time during which she would find herself in different rooms with no memory of movement, sometimes with evidence of activities she had not consciously performed. February 27, 1897 woke at my desk before dawn, pen in hand, though I retired to bed at the usual hour. The page before me contained writing not my own, a detailed chemical formula expanding upon Uncle Solomon's original moon salt compound, with modifications to increase permeability and facilitate complete transference. The handwriting matches samples of Solomon's from the album. More disturbing still, I found chemicals purchased from Haverstock's apothecary on my work table, materials I have no recollection of ordering. My own shadow no longer moves precisely with me. It turns its head when my attention is elsewhere, reaches for objects I do not touch. I have begun avoiding mirrors, unable to bear the sight of my reflection with its desynchronized shadow self, always slightly out of alignment, watching me with eyes that are not my own. March 3, 1897, last resort. Have telegraphed cousin James in Chicago to come at once. Cannot trust myself alone with the album any longer. The shadows speak now in voices just below the threshold of comprehension. They promise revelation, transcendence. They offer to show me what they showed Solomon, the world behind the world, the negative space where light is absence and darkness has form and will. May God forgive me, but part of me yearns to see it. They say I am special, chosen, that the bloodline makes me an ideal vessel. They whisper that Solomon lives still, after a fashion, his consciousness preserved within their collective, and that he waits to welcome me. I find myself standing before the camera at odd hours, finger poised over the shutter release, trembling with equal measures of terror and anticipation. James arrives tomorrow. Until then, I have locked myself in the root cellar where no shadows can form in the absolute darkness. I write by the light of a single candle, watching as its flame casts my words into momentary illumination before the darkness reclaims them. Like truth, like sanity, like all certainties in a world where shadows hunger and move and remember. This was the final entry in Margaret's hand. The next document was a brief note dated March 5, 1897, written by James Merrick. Arrived Boston p.m. March 4th. Found house empty, signs of disturbance throughout. No trace of Margaret. Album located in photography studio, open to final pages, camera aimed at empty chair. Have developed the exposed plate found in camera. God help us all. Have secured album in lead-lined case as per family protocol. Will consult father's notes for guidance on containment procedures. The photograph that followed showed an empty chair, its shadow stretching across the floor and up the wall behind it, but the shadow was not of a chair. It depicted a woman standing, arms outstretched, head thrown back, her features clearly recognizable as Margaret Merrick despite the impossibility of such a shadow being cast by an empty piece of furniture. And surrounding her shadow self were other, darker silhouettes, including one that resembled descriptions and images of Solomon Merrick, its arm extended toward her in what might have been welcome or triumph. A newspaper clipping from the Boston Globe, dated March 10, 1897, reported Margaret Merrick's disappearance, noting that the unmarried teacher and amateur photographer had last been seen by neighbors on March 3. Police were investigating but had no leads. A final note from James Merrick, dated December 1897. The investigation into Margaret's disappearance has been officially closed, her case relegated to the unsolved files of the Boston Police Department. I alone know what truly happened, though I can scarcely bear to contemplate it. The album has been sealed with additional precautions. A steel box within the lead lining, secured with multiple locks to which only I possess the keys. I have relocated to a remote property in western Massachusetts, far from neighbors who might be endangered should the containment fail. Here I will serve as warden to this terrible legacy until such time as a permanent solution presents itself, or until death forces me to pass this burden to another. The shadows are patient. I have learned to never photograph them, to avoid looking directly at them, to keep my home brightly lit at all hours. But sometimes, in the moment between wakefulness and sleep, I hear them whispering from the corners of my bedroom, promising that my cousin and uncle wait for me in the world beyond the negative. where darkness has weight and will and hunger, where family is reunited in eternal shadow. May God have mercy on us all. The album contained no further entries until a brief note dated 1956, written by Margaret Merrick. Not the same Margaret who had disappeared in 1897, but her grandniece and namesake who had inherited custodianship of the album. The burden passes to me upon the death of my father, who maintained the protocols established by his grandfather. For 60 years, the album has remained sealed and secure. I will continue this vigilance, though I question the superstition that surrounds this family artifact. As a modern woman with scientific education, I find it difficult to credit the fantastic elements of the family history. Yet I cannot dismiss entirely the deep unease I feel in the presence of the album, nor the vivid dreams that have plagued me since it came into my possession, dreams of darkness that moves with purpose, and relatives long dead who beckon from thresholds that should not exist. The protocols will be maintained. The album will remain sealed. Some family traditions, however irrational, deserve respect. The chronicle ended there, with no further entries until the letter I had received with the album itself, from the second Margaret Merrick, now in her 90s, passing the burden to me, an unrelated scholar who might approach the materials with professional detachment rather than hereditary dread. As I closed this section of the album, I became acutely aware of the lengthening shadows in my study as evening descended. Had that darkness in the corner moved slightly? Was my own shadow perfectly aligned with my body? Or was there a subtle desynchronization I hadn't noticed before? I reached quickly for the light switch, flooding the room with harsh electric brightness that banished the deeper shadows but could not dispel the growing certainty that I was no longer alone in my home, that by studying these photographs, by bearing witness to Solomon Merrick's terrible work, I had drawn the attention of something ancient and patient that waited in the negative spaces between light and form, something that had found its way through the gateway of silver and shadow that Merrick had unwittingly created, and that now watched me through the darkness, wearing the faces of those it had claimed before me, hungry for a new vessel, a new shadow to inhabit. I did not sleep that night. How could I, with the knowledge that now burdened me? Instead, I surrounded myself with light, every lamp in my home blazing, even as I knew the electricity bill would be astronomical. Better that than the alternative. During those sleepless hours, I pored over the final section of Merrick's album, pages that the last Margaret Merrick had apparently added herself, documenting her own investigations during her long decades as custodian of this terrible legacy. Unlike her predecessors, Margaret had approached the phenomenon with scientific methodology, conducting carefully controlled experiments while maintaining strict containment protocols. Her notes, spanning from the late 1950s through the early 2000s, chronicled a methodical exploration of what she termed the Merrick anomaly. April 15, 1957, first controlled observation conducted today. The album was removed from its container under specific conditions. Full daylight, outdoors, multiple witnesses present, colleagues Dr. Robert Chambers and Dr. Eliza Morton from the physics department, complete photographic and film documentation. The album itself appears unchanged, no detectable radiation, no unusual magnetic fields, temperature normal. However, upon reviewing the film footage, something extraordinary appears. Shadows cast by the album do not match its physical form, instead suggesting a much larger object with irregular extensions. This anomaly is visible only on film, not to the naked eye. Neither Chambers nor Morton observed it during the experiment, and both dismissed the film anomaly as processing error. I remain unconvinced. The family lore suggests that photographic media itself is integral to the manifestation of the phenomenon, that cameras and film somehow bridge the gap between our reality and what Uncle Solomon called the negative space. This may explain why the anomalous shadow was captured on film while remaining invisible to direct observation. The next several entries detailed increasingly sophisticated experiments involving specialized photographic equipment, various light sources, and multiple recording methods. Margaret had clearly dedicated significant resources to this investigation, though her notes indicated she kept the true purpose hidden from her academic colleagues, presenting the research under the guise of studying anomalous photographic artifacts in historical imagery. November 30, 1963 breakthrough achieved using the new ultraviolet photography system. When photographed under UV light, The album reveals substantial differences from its visible appearance. The leather binding appears to be infused with a network of fine, dark lines resembling a circulatory system or mycelial network. More disturbing, the photographs themselves show additional figures not visible under normal lighting. Shadow entities standing behind or beside the human subjects, some with features that resemble Solomon Merrick himself. Most significant, under UV light, the moon salt compound embedded in the photographic emulsion fluoresces with distinctive patterns that change over time, even when the album is sealed in complete darkness between observations. The compound appears to be in constant, subtle motion, reorganizing itself like a living organism. Chemical analysis reveals components consistent with Solomon's notes, silver nitrate, moonstone, and botanical extracts, but also unidentified organic compounds that match no known reference samples. These compounds contain molecular structures that should be unstable, yet persist in defiance of established chemical principles. Dr. Chambers suggests they may represent an alternative biochemistry, but cannot explain their origin or persistence. Margaret's investigation took a darker turn in the early 1970s. February 17, 1972. I have begun to question the wisdom of this research. 3 graduate students who assisted with the UV photography sessions have reported identical symptoms: insomnia, visual disturbances, particularly in low light conditions, and intrusive thoughts described as not their own. Most troubling, all 3 have independently created artwork depicting the same image: a tall, thin male figure standing in a doorway formed of darkness, beckoning to the viewer. None have seen the actual photographs from the album, as I maintain strict protocols limiting their exposure to the UV imaging equipment only. Yet somehow, the imagery has transferred to their consciousness. I have terminated their involvement immediately and referred them for psychiatric evaluation, though I doubt conventional treatment will address the true source of their symptoms. April 3, 1972. Michael Chun, one of the affected students, has been hospitalized following what authorities describe as a psychotic episode. According to the police report, he covered the walls of his apartment with identical drawings of the beckoning figure, then attempted to follow it through a doorway he had painted on his wall in his own blood. When the painted doorway did not open, he attempted to make a more permanent opening with a kitchen knife, inflicting severe self-injury. During my hospital visit, he recognized me despite heavy sedation. His words haunt me. "The doctor is waiting for you, Professor Merrick. He says the family always returns to the negative space eventually. He says blood calls to blood, and shadow calls to shadow." I have suspended all research involving direct examination of the album. The containment protocols will be reinforced, and I will focus solely on theoretical analysis of existing data. For nearly a decade, Margaret's entries consisted only of annual confirmation that the containment remains secure, with no further experimental work. But in 1981, the tone changed again. October 12, 1981. Dreams have begun again, more vivid than ever. I see Uncle Solomon clearly now, not as the formal portrait in the album but as something changed, elongated, his proportions subtly wrong, his movements fluid in ways human anatomy should not permit. He speaks to me in these dreams, his voice resonating not in my ears but in my mind directly. He claims the boundary between worlds thins in certain locations, at certain times, places where tragedy or intense emotion has imprinted on reality, or during celestial alignments that occur in cycles beyond human reckoning. He says the next convergence approaches, when the veil will be at its most permeable. Most disturbing is his insistence that I have a role to play, that the Merrick bloodline was chosen generations before his birth, prepared through subtle manipulations by those who dwell in the shadow realm. He says my lifelong interest in photographic technology is no coincidence, but an inherited predisposition, guiding me toward completion of work he began. I wake from these dreams to find my shadow misaligned, moving with a slight delay after my own movements, turning its head when my attention is elsewhere. I have begun avoiding mirrors. Margaret's entries became increasingly erratic through the 1980s, alternating between periods of scientific detachment and episodes of apparent paranoia. She documented shadow anomalies in her home, unexplained equipment failures in her laboratory, and persistent dreams of Solomon Merrick and what she called the waiting ones, who accompanied him in the darkness. In 1989, a significant shift occurred. March 15, 1989. I can fight this no longer. The boundary between waking and dreaming has grown too thin, the call of the negative space too compelling. I understand now what drew Uncle Solomon forward. Not madness but clarity, not delusion but revelation. There is another reality interwoven with our own, existing in the negative spaces we dismiss as mere absence of light. The shadow beings are not invaders but original inhabitants, pushed aside by the expanding dominance of light and form in our dimension. The moon salt compound creates a permeable membrane between these realms, allowing perception and eventually transition. Solomon did not die or disappear. He evolved, transcended the limitations of physical form to join a more ancient mode of existence. He has been waiting for another Merrick to follow, to complete the bridge between worlds that his initial work began. I have recreated his formula with modern adjustments. Tonight, during the lunar eclipse, I will attempt controlled manifestation, using myself as both observer and subject. The camera is prepared, the chemicals mixed. If I do not return from this experience, this record will explain my absence. The entry ended there. The next item was a photograph unlike any previous image in the album, a modern color print showing Margaret's home laboratory. The room appeared empty of human presence, but a shadow on the wall clearly depicted a woman with arms outstretched, head tilted back, fingers elongated into impossible tapers that reached toward the ceiling. Around this central shadow were darker patches that resolved, upon closer inspection, into silhouettes of other figures, some recognizably human in outline, others distorted beyond recognition, with suggestions of limbs and appendages that corresponded to no earthly anatomy. A brief note, dated the following day in handwriting that resembled Margaret's but displayed subtle differences. More angular, with unusual pressure patterns. The transition was successful but incomplete. I exist now in both realms simultaneously, my consciousness divided between physical form and shadow essence. Solomon was right. The experience defies conventional language, but perhaps can be understood as an expansion rather than a replacement of being. The others are not what I expected. Not malevolent, exactly, but profoundly alien consciousnesses that formed in darkness rather than light, perceiving reality through density rather than illumination. They have existed alongside humanity since before recorded history, watching, occasionally reaching through when conditions permit, drawn to certain bloodlines that resonate with their frequencies. The Merrick line has always been particularly receptive, dating back to an ancestor who participated in alchemical experiments in 15th century Prague. Solomon was not the first to glimpse the shadow realm, merely the first to devise a technological means of bridging it. I understand now why the album must be preserved rather than destroyed. It serves as an anchor point, a stable junction between realms. To destroy it would not close the passage but rupture it, creating unpredictable breaches that could allow uncontrolled manifestation. I will maintain my human existence as custodian while exploring the shadow realm through my divided consciousness. This dual perspective offers unprecedented research opportunities. The others have knowledge to share, ancient understanding of physics, consciousness, and reality itself that could revolutionize human science if properly translated. This began the strangest chapter of the album, nearly 3 decades of entries documenting Margaret's existence as what she described as a bridge entity, maintaining her human life and academic career while simultaneously exploring the shadow realm during periods of trance or sleep. Her notes became increasingly complex, attempting to describe experiences that seemed to defy conventional physics and perception. June 21, 1990. Movement in the shadow realm occurs through intention rather than physical locomotion. Distance is a function of relationship rather than spatial measurement. Entities that share stronger connections exist in closer proximity, regardless of where their anchors, what we would call casting objects, exist in the physical world. The others communicate through impression rather than language, direct transmission of concept clusters that unfold in the receiving consciousness. Solomon has become highly adept at this form of exchange, serving as translator between my still partially human understanding and the truly ancient ones who never knew physical form. They show me histories that contradict all human knowledge, cycles of civilization rising and falling, not just on Earth but across countless worlds, some physical, some existing in states of matter we have yet to discover. They show me technologies based on principles that violate our understanding of natural law, manipulations of light, shadow, and the boundary between them that make our most advanced physics seem primitive. January 17, 1993, the shadow entities perceive time differently, not as linear progression but as layers of experience that can be traversed in multiple directions. Through their perception, I have glimpsed what humans would call the future, possible configurations of events that branch and intersect like crystalline structures. Most converge toward a significant transition, a period when the boundaries between realms will thin globally, allowing greater interaction between shadow and light. Some branches lead to harmonious integration, others to chaos as unprepared human consciousness confronts perceptual frameworks it cannot comprehend. The others believe the Merrick work, our documentation and controlled manifestation techniques, may be crucial in preparing humanity for this eventual convergence. This explains their persistent interest in our bloodline, their careful cultivation of our perceptual abilities across generations. They are not gods or demons, as human mythology might categorize them, but simply different expressions of consciousness that evolved in conditions we would consider impossible. To them, we are equally exotic creatures of light and transient form, our brief lifespans like momentary flashes against the eternal darkness they inhabit. As the years progressed, Margaret's entries became increasingly esoteric, filled with complex mathematical notations and diagrams that appeared to represent multidimensional structures. Her handwriting alternated between her original style and the more angular variation, sometimes changing mid-sentence as if two different aspects of her consciousness were competing for control of the documentation. The final entry, dated just 3 weeks before I received the album, was written entirely in the angular script. January 27, 2025. The convergence approaches more rapidly than anticipated. The others have shown me the patterns forming across global consciousness, the collective human shadow growing more receptive to contact, more aware of the negative space that has always existed alongside perceived reality. I am in the final stages of transition now, my physical form failing while my shadow self strengthens. Soon I will join Solomon and the others completely, existing solely in the realm beyond light. Before this completion, I must ensure the album passes to a new custodian, one with sufficient understanding of photographic processes to appreciate its significance, yet no blood connection to the Merrick line that might accelerate unwanted manifestation. I have identified a suitable candidate, a professor of photographic history whose published work demonstrates both technical knowledge and philosophical openness. The album will be sent upon my physical death, with minimal explanation. The material must speak for itself as it did to Solomon, as it did to me. Each custodian must come to understanding through direct experience rather than predetermined expectation. To you who now reads these words, you have been chosen not as victim but as witness. The shadows have always been with you, patient and watching. Now they are awakening, stirring with renewed purpose as the convergence nears. How you respond will determine much. Remember, they are drawn to observation. Every photograph is a window. Every shadow contains depth beyond its apparent dimensions. And the Merrick legacy continues through anyone who truly sees. The album ended there, with several blank pages remaining, waiting, I supposed with growing horror, for my own documentation, my own descent into the shadow realm that had claimed the Merricks before me. I closed the album with trembling hands, acutely aware of the darkness that had fallen outside my study windows while I was immersed in Margaret's decades-long transformation. The room felt colder now, the shadows in the corners deeper, more substantial. Was it my imagination, or did they pulse slightly with a rhythm suggesting respiration? Did that darkness beneath my desk shift independent of any light source movement? And my own shadow, cast by the desk lamp across the wall, was its head turned at precisely the same angle as my own, or was there a subtle misalignment, a suggestion of independent awareness? I reached for the telephone to call a colleague, seeking the reassurance of human connection, only to find the line dead. Not even a dial tone, just empty silence. My cell phone showed no service, though it had been functioning perfectly earlier that day. On my computer screen, A document I had been working on before opening the album had changed. The text replaced by a single line, repeated across the entire page. The custodian awakens. The bridge forms. The doorway opens. And in that moment, I felt it. A presence behind me, not physical but substantial in a way that transcended conventional matter. A cold pressure against my back like an exhaled breath from a mouth far larger than any human anatomy. I turned, slowly, to face the corner of my study that had fallen into deeper shadow than the surrounding areas. Within that darkness, I could discern a suggestion of form. Tall and thin, with proportions that seemed to shift and flow as if underwater. And then eyes, not glowing, but darker still than the shadow that contained them. Two absolute voids that fixed upon me with unmistakable recognition. It stepped forward, or perhaps more accurately, the shadow expanded toward me, resolving into a silhouette I recognized from the album's earliest photographs. Solomon Merrick, transformed by his decades in the negative space, elongated and fluid, yet still recognizably the man who had first breached the boundary between worlds. Behind him gathered other shadows, some human in outline, others entirely alien, suggestions of limbs and appendages that bent at impossible angles, faces that seemed to form and dissolve and reform in patterns that strained the mind's ability to process. Among them, I could discern a female figure that must be Margaret, her form already beginning to lose its human proportions as she adapted to her new state of existence. Solomon's shadow self raised an arm, impossibly long, the fingers tapering into points that seemed miles distant though confined within my small study, and gestured toward the album on my desk. Not a command but an invitation, an offer to continue the documentation, to bear witness to the transition that he and Margaret had experienced. The camera I use for photographing historical documents sat on a shelf across the room. Even as rational thought screamed for me to flee, to destroy the album, to escape the fate that had claimed the Merricks, I found my hand reaching for the camera, drawn by curiosity that transcended fear. What would I see if I photographed these shadow entities? What would the camera reveal that my limited human perception could not yet process? As my fingers closed around the familiar weight of the camera, Solomon's shadow seemed to smile. Not a human expression but a deepening of darkness, a concentration of presence that conveyed satisfaction, anticipation. The others crowded closer, their shadow forms overlapping, merging at the edges in ways that suggested both individual consciousness and collective existence. I raised the camera, finger poised over the shutter release, knowing that this action,